Hi everyone, MJ from Retro Revive Mods here, and today we have a custom order where the customer wants to upgrade his Gameboy Advance into a drop-in IPS, capacitors and speakers replaced, and also a USB-C battery. I usually don't like to do a drop-in IPS mod as it requires trimming of the shell, but the customer told me that this Gameboy Advance was gifted to him by his current wife, and thus I can see the sentimental value behind it, so let's go ahead and do that. As you can see, the Gameboy Advance is not really turning on, and I suspect this was because the power switch is dirty, which is why I just did that. And yes, it boots. Amazing. Now that we know it turns on, we can start working on it. Let's start. The GBA is one of the most annoying Game Boys to open up as it has so many screws, and for some reason, the screws on the back are so tight, especially for those aftermarket shells. After removing the back, we can see the PCB inside, and honestly, it's quite amazing how clean this is. He must have really kept it well. A lot of the invoices that were sent to me for repair are usually plagued by corrosion, so it's really nice to see that this is extremely clean. Lastly, we just need to remove and unlatch the screen ribbon cable so that we can remove the entire PCB from the shell. Taking a look at the other side of the PCB, I'm so glad that it's so clean. When it comes to corrosion, the worst thing that happens is when the buttons themselves are corroded. Now let's remove the screen from the shell, and to do this we just need to go through a little twisting motion and loosen up the adhesive that sticks the screen onto the shell. Next, let's remove the old speaker from the PCB, and the way I do this is by heating up the legs of the speaker and just gently pulling on them. I also like to remove the old solder by adding some flux, heating the pads, and then coming in with a solder sucker. Honestly, I don't usually do this and I prefer using a desoldering wick, and you can kind of see me struggling in this process. Now that we got the old solder out, I like to put the legs of the speaker through the holes before soldering them on. And just solder the speaker on by heating the pads and the legs of the speaker and then adding solder in.
No.
Just to touch up the process, I like to heat the other end again and to push the speaker inwards even more. Now let's change the capacitors of the GBA. The GBA has 4 capacitors, 3 that can be replaced with 100 microfarads, 6.3 volts, and the other big one which is 470 microfarads and it's also 6.3 volts if I'm not wrong. My preferred method of removing old capacitors is simply by twisting them with a plier, and the way I do this is to apply a downward motion and then just twist them until it gets loose and loose enough to break off from the board. I know it might seem dangerous and scary, but honestly this is one of the best methods of removing old capacitors, but that's assuming that there isn't much corrosion on the board itself. The 470 microfarads capacitor is also glued down on the GBA board, and thus it's harder to remove the plastic bit. And over here I'm heating the solder pads and trying to remove the plastic, and that piece of plastic will never be found ever again. As the twisting method of removing old capacitors leaves behind the legs of the capacitors, we need to come in with our soldering iron to remove the legs first before doing anything else. Next, we'll add some no-clean flux before using our desoldering wick. Next, we need to solder in new capacitors, and the way I do it is to add solder on one side of the solder pad first, and then adding the capacitor in by sliding in. Once that side is done, we move on to the other side, heating the leg of the capacitor and the solder pad, and then adding solder into it. Over here, I'm cutting one part of the plastic piece of the capacitor so that it can fit onto the board eventually. Having removed so many capacitors, I feel that this is one of the best methods as it reduces stress on the legs themselves. I used to add solder to both the pads and then push the capacitor downwards, and I felt that this was very troublesome. Over here, I'm demonstrating this technique again, and just feel free to try this technique out yourself as well and let me know whether it works out for you. Make sure you apply enough heat to both the leg of the capacitor and the solder pad to allow solder to flow between them. After you're done with the capacitors, make sure to clean the board with 99% IPA. Alright, now we are finally moving on to the installation of the drop-in IPS. And for this, we need to trim the corners that are closer to the D-pad. Make sure to finish off by filing down the area so that it doesn't cause any scratches to your screen. This is how it should roughly look like after trimming the shell. Next, for the installation of the drop-in IPS, I usually don't like to use the touch sensors as they can be unreliable, and thus I'm adding solder to the solder pads to enable button controls later on. Solder the wires into each of the pads included into the kit. We will then need to solder the other side of the select wire into TP2. Left will go to TP9. And lastly, right to TP8. GBA motherboards can either be 32 or 40 pin, so make sure to use the right flex cable. I like to do a little test before closing everything up using crocodile clips, and great, it works! As a final measure, always clean your button contacts before closing them up. The installation of the USB-C battery also requires some sort of trimming, but it's very easy, just trim out the divider. And one of the most satisfying parts is to install the screen lens itself. And we are done with the repair and upgrade. If you'd like to see me do more of these repairs or upgrades, do like and subscribe to my channel or follow my socials. Or if you have any other mods that you'd like me to do comment down below. Thanks for watching and see you guys around.